You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us. Reminder to everybody out there, please check us out on all the social media sites. Facebook at Hazard Ground Podcast. Instagram is the same, Hazard Ground Podcast. Also on Twitter at Hazard Ground. And stay tuned. Not sure when this podcast will actually air, but our website is almost up and running, hazardgroundpodcast.com. So we'll let you know when that actually gets live. But stay tuned for everything that we have going on. Joining us in this week's episode is a former Army sergeant and member of the 75th Ranger Regiment, and he now has aspirations as a filmmaker and making a film about a former Hazard Ground Podcast guest. We will get to all of that later on. He is Joel Carpenter joining us. Joel, welcome. Thank you for being here.
Mark, thanks so much to you and Hazard Ground for having me.
All right, brother. You know, you and I have talked a lot over the past couple of months, and we've talked about a whole bunch of other things other than your particular story. So I wanted to hear about you, and I wanted the listeners of this podcast to hear about you and tell us how you got your start and why you ended up in the military.
Yeah, so going all the way back, I was a military brat, and so long line of military in my family, and kind of hadn't really made that decision in my life of what I wanted to be, but there was basically narrowed down to two things. I wanted to be in special operations, or I wanted to go out to Hollywood and give a crack at, acting and filmmaking and all that. And so when I was 20 years old, I dropped out of college after 3 years attending and went out to Los Angeles, didn't know anybody, and took a crack at the acting and filmmaking world, and ended up enlisting in the 75th Ranger Regiment after September 11th. I think for all of us, that day kind of changed all of us at some level. And for me, I had been in Hollywood when I first went out in 1996. And had been there for a little bit, going on auditions, and had written a screenplay that had gotten a lot of attention with different companies. I was having, big meetings at some of the studios and some of the local production companies. And then September 11th happened, and it kind of just, it changed everything for me. And I thought it was something I was going to be able to adjust fire from and kind of snap back into focus on the screenwriting and the acting. But it just really resonated with me. And before I knew it, I was up there at, I think it's the Hollywood and Vine intersection. There was a recruiting station with the Navy and the Army and the Marines. And I was talking to all those and kind of looked at every option, from SEALs to Marines and then Rangers to Green Berets, and ended up going with the Army Ranger contract.
So
within a year, I was in Savannah, Georgia.
But let's back up for a second. So where were you on 9/11? What were you doing when it happened? Because if that was the catalyst, I'm curious how far along you were in the Hollywood thing. That, was it like a paradigm shift to pull out? Were you moving along, or were you struggling?
Yeah. So, I always felt like I was on the cusp, but I think everybody feels that way, and they say kind of dedicate yourself to 10 years and then see where you're at and then make an assessment. And for me, I was kind of approaching, I was a little bit over the halfway mark. And I really felt that I was getting to where I needed to be. I had auditioned for some lead roles. I had auditioned for some major films, studio films. One of them was She's All That. Freddie Prinze Jr. ended up getting it. Saw him at the audition. Auditioned for Cruel Intentions 2, and a number of other things. And so I felt like it was a numbers game. And then the screenplay that I had written really kind of blew up for me in the city. It was a hot read for a bit, and so that changed everything. That got me representation, literary representation. Same people that were repping Paul Walker and like Shannon Elizabeth at the time, and so I felt like it was headed in the right direction. So for me, it definitely was a paradigm shift, as you say. When it happened, I was down in visiting a friend in Newport Beach, and I was actually writing a screenplay. It was Right to Hire, and I was kind of wrapping that up, and he burst in, in the morning, and it was like 6:30 a.m. or whatever it was, and had said that the terrorists had attacked the towers, and I remember just responding, and I just was like, again, it was like, I mean, are these guys going after this again? So, yeah, that was where I was at. So I hadn't quite made it, but was closer than I ever was in the 6 years that I'd been there.
I'd say you basically hit every late 90s movie that we all love, and every late 90s actor or actress that we all love. I mean, Paul Walker, you had, Can't Hardly Wait, you had She's All That, whatever it is. I mean, those were all the movies from that era that were exploding.
Yeah, and what I always thought it would be a really hilarious comedy to make a movie about the guys, or the guy maybe who is always the runner-up, or the guy who gets goes out for the part but doesn't get it. You kind of always wonder, like, all the guys who auditioned for movies and then never ended up getting the roles. But I was one of those guys. Yeah,
you're talking to another one. I'm second place in life, but it's better than last. But there you go. So that's why I'm on a podcast here. But beyond that, no, seriously, I mean, that's the fact that you were able to just, make that decision always impresses me. Like I was, in ROTC, and I was already in the Army prior to 9/11. In fact, I had gotten off active duty just prior to 9/11. And, the decision for me was easy. I was already there, but it's the people who did it right after 9/11. There's so many of them who have been on this podcast. That really, to me, is like one of those things where I tip my cap, because at that point, it's easy to run. Like, it's easy to say, hell no, I'm not getting involved in this. And there's a lot of people who raised their head and said, no, I want to be at the front of this thing.
Yeah. And I remember, I mean, I was really caught up in the LA scene. The parties. There was this place called Garden of Eden, and a friend of mine was like somewhat of a co-owner. And I can remember, at first everybody, around LA and Hollywood scene was like, oh man, I'm enlisting, I'm going out, I'm signing papers tomorrow and all this kind of stuff. And I was one of those guys, and slowly it started filtering out to where, people went back to their normal lives and started partying. And then that talk about, I'm going to enlist, I'm going to go do this. It filtered out as well. And for me, that first kind of few weeks was, there were literally, I mean, there was American flags everywhere, and they were banners of American flags. There were American flags in these chain link fences that would go up the 101 highway. And I remember just feeling like, I'm sure everybody at the time was super patriotic and just completely changed and in shock. And then just a few weeks later, what really, really got me, because I was trying to decide, what do I do? This is like completely opposite of what I'd plan on doing. But what really kind of pushed me kind of over the edge was a few weeks later, when things started going back to normal, the same American flags that were literally everywhere, like, I mean, just everywhere, were now being blown. They were in the streets, and they were, in the corners of the gutters. And I remember feeling like a lot of anxiety driving through the streets, and like feeling compelled to pull my vehicle over and to actually get out and like pick up every single, American flag sticker or American flag or whatever. And I just, at that point, that's really what drove me into making that decision.
So you end up in Savannah, Georgia. You enlist, you go to a Ranger contract. Biggest shock, biggest surprise of the whole process as far as through basic training and into Ranger school?
Oh my gosh. I mean, like the whole thing. It was,
we're not in Hollywood anymore.
No, 100%. And it just, every moment was like, kind of pinch myself and make sure this isn't a dream type thing. I mean, when I showed up basic, I'm sure everybody had a similar feeling. It felt like, prison and sitting on my bunk that night, with 100 plus other guys in a big barracks room and just thinking like, what the hell did I just do? And then, but seeing there was a Ranger uniform, I remember, in the 30th AG processing center, and it was in the lobby, and I remember seeing it had the Ranger tab and the Ranger scroll, and it had the tambourine, and it was on a mannequin, but it looked so sharp. And I remember walking in and having that RIP contract. Back then it was RIP, and now it's called RAS, but having that contract and just seeing that uniform and thinking like, okay, that's what I want. I don't have any contingencies, to acquiring it. That's what I want. It seemed so far away. And yet it was kind of like just there, kind of like almost like, Hollywood, where it was like, right in front of me, but I still had to perform to get it. And so, slowly each phase, whether it was basic was a lot harder than I anticipated. Going through airborne, RIP. So getting closer and closer, to something that was so surreal, the whole process of enlisting and going through that. And then something that's, everybody says is so hard to achieve, and there's only a small percentage of, an elite, community. And then, inching my way closer to that, it was always surprising, I think, for me, and pushing myself to limits that I didn't know I was capable of. Every day was a surprise.
And when, for listeners who aren't military, when Joel says RIP, it just stands for Ranger Indoctrination Program, and it's basically the lead up. You sign a Ranger contract when you get in. If that's what you want to do, they'll give you some extra training and some extra help along the way, essentially, to make sure that you can get through Ranger School. So that's what he's talking about when he says RIP. So when you graduate Ranger School, I should say before you graduated, was there like motivation saying, "Hey, I'm not going to finish second this time"? Because everything that was going on in Hollywood, was that part of your thinking?
Yeah, it was, it's hard to explain, but to me, as hard as Ranger School was, it seemed more achievable or easier for me than even Hollywood. Hollywood, I always felt a little bit awkward there, even though I for whatever reason, I wanted to, be up there and try to get into film. I always loved film, even when I was a kid. But I think for me, Rangers was, the training process, the indoctrination process was something where I saw the energy and the whatever I put into it. It seemed like if you worked really hard, that you got a return on it. There was a return of investment on it, and that's something I didn't really see in LA and in Hollywood. It seemed like it didn't matter how hard you worked, you still could come up empty. And this, it felt more like, and I guess I could have still came up empty, but this, it felt more like, okay, so you're telling me if I run, this 2 mile, in this time, I'm going to get this score. It was all very precise, and it seemed like there was an answer to everything. And so it seemed like there was a lot of structure, and that maybe made it a little bit easier for me.
So you graduate Ranger School, probably one of the proudest moments of your life. What's next for you, and how quickly do you end up on a deployment in a plane overseas?
Yeah, so, Ranger Regiment back then, so graduating RIP was amazing for me. So, after airborne, going straight over to the RIP, and a little bit of a holdover, and then going over. So that was an amazing moment, very surreal moment. And then, going to 1st Ranger Battalion as basically a probationary ranger is really what it is. You have your scroll, the unit scroll, but you do not have the ranger tab yet. So you reported to the unit, and then you would train up with the unit. You get really seasoned with current rangers, and you go to your platoon. You get assigned to your squad, and then I actually was deployed before Ranger School, and that's usually, at least back then, that's usually how it would happen. So you'd actually show up, probationary kind of status. You would go train, and then you'd get a combat deployment, and then you come back, and depending on performance and maybe level of maturity and how they viewed perception from your current leadership, then they would have so many slots, and they'd say, hey, you're going to Ranger School, or whoever's going to Ranger School. And so after the initial Iraq invasion, we returned back and had a little bit of a summer, and then I was told I was going to Ranger School shortly after.
Okay, so you didn't go right away. Obviously, it was just detailed. You didn't go right away, right after you got out of basic and airborne and everything else. Some people go straight through. When you got to the Ranger Regiment and you didn't have your Ranger tab, did you feel like that odd man out again?
No, because it's standard. Never like the odd man out, but more like starting at the bottom, like right of entry. I mean, at every level, it was always right of entry, and I didn't see that really let up until basically they kind of said like, "Hey, we're sending you to Ranger School," and definitely after you came back from Ranger School. After you came back from Ranger School, when I came back, it changed everything. I mean, like, when I first got to unit, it was the squad leaders. I had a couple of different squad leaders, but one of the squad leaders, the one that ended up sending me to Ranger School, he's very tough, and people, whatever they want to call, in terms of hazing it as a right of entry or whatever it was, it was pretty challenging, and so earning that right of entry and then going to get the Ranger tab and understanding how far anyone who goes there can push themselves as long as they're given 110%. Then you come back and you feel like, okay, it's time for a change. Like, and you feel it from everybody else. They give you the respect now.
So tell me about the first deployment. You mentioned the initial invasion into Iraq in 2003. What was your job there, and kind of what were you told, and what were the expectations?
Mm-hmm. So when I first showed up at First Ranger Battalion, the selection and platoon assignment happened when I got pushed out on a detail for a general's retirement at Fort Bragg. And so by the time I came back, the guys that I went through RIP with had already been assigned to the line platoons and different squads, and I was one of the last guys. And so when I came back, they had assigned me to what's referred to as AT or anti-tank, and I didn't even know what it was. Everybody's like, "Hey, you're an AT," and I was like, "Great, what's AT?" So my initial deployment was part of an anti-tank squad, and we were assigned to the different platoons, and so that was a really interesting dynamic because it gave me an opportunity to get to know the whole company, because I would basically be with one platoon for several missions, and then they might change it up and they might send us. It was basically gun team attachments, and they'd send us to other teams, and so very quickly I was introduced to the whole company, and that was my responsibility. I was an assistant gunner, basically, and the team leader, E5 team leader, was the gunner for the Carl Gustaf. So that was the 2003 deployment. Now the Carl Gustaf was only used several times during the deployment, so most of the time what ended up happening was I just snapped in with the squads and would just end up clearing buildings or sitting in a fixed position, static site position, for overwatch in the area.
So what was the craziest thing you saw during the invasion, or the craziest thing you did? I mean, what stands out about that deployment to you?
Gosh, it's really hard to say because the deployment kind of happened very quickly. I think we deployed over in like February or some point, and then ended up coming back at like early April, early to mid-April. And I think it was just living out, I don't have any crazy comments for it. I think it was the actual environment itself, because in subsequent deployments, everything was there. And so for us, it was the environment, landing in a country where there was no infrastructure in terms of, for the U.S. And so everything that we were doing, we were living out of, rucksacks and the size of our Humvees, and they gave us a packing list that was basically like 3 pairs of socks, 3 pairs of underwear, 3 T-shirts, poncho liner, and this being my first deployment, it's like, you believe the packing list, and then all of a sudden you're out there, and you might be out there for a month or whatever, so you're just cycling out those things. And so, some of the sandstorms that we encountered were just brutal. You know, we there was one sandstorm that was like 5 days long, and I remember sitting on a 50 cal on the top of a Humvee, and I couldn't even see like the end of the barrel because the dust was so thick, and I was just thinking like, wow, this is unbelievable. We went on a bunch of different missions. Some of them were kind of search and destroy kind of missions, and different airfield takedowns, and those were all fun, but never just really encountered any sort of real resistance. It was just everybody was basically surrendering.
Did you feel like during that deployment, hey, this is why I wanted to be a Ranger, or was it kind of the other way around? Like, this is what I signed up for. Like, I thought this was going to be totally different.
No, because it wasn't like we didn't perform. It's just that we were so hard charging with everything that we did in terms of mission, and everything was so spot on that there just wasn't a worthy adversary.
Right.
And so it wasn't like there was no, in that deployment, it was not like we didn't do anything. It's just that we never came up against something, that was worthy of the training and the stuff that we did. It wasn't like, as we've referenced before, it wasn't like a Tacker Gar scenario. So you still do, the mission work and you still do these things, but sometimes it's just not there. Other deployments, completely different story.
Sure. And let's go to those, because you said you go back, you go to Ranger School, you get your tab. Unless there's anything remarkable you want to talk about that, how quickly do you get back to your second deployment after Ranger School?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I got back from Ranger School in November. That was November of 2003 was my class. It had ended like right around Thanksgiving.
Did you get recycled, or no? You made it straight through in 9 weeks.
No, oddly enough, I did not get recycled for Ranger School, but strangely enough, I got recycled during pre-Ranger, which is run by Regiment. So, but which was very frustrating at the time. But the class after me happened to be like all of my good friends from 1st Ranger Battalion, and then Pat and Kevin Tillman also came in on that class as well, and I ended up becoming good friends with them.
And everybody, obviously,
positive.
Yeah, everybody knows Pat's story and his brother Kevin. Both of them, Pat obviously giving up the NFL contract, but they both joined up and were Rangers. Tell me about those guys real quick. I mean, I want to hear your story, but obviously, considering the names, how much interaction did you have with Pat, and what was your impressions?
Yeah, so with Pat and Kevin, just like super, super great guys. Everybody always talking about how great they were, and I actually knew some people who knew them before I'd ever finished Ranger School, or before I think I was still just brand new to Regiment and on a block leave, and somebody was telling me about them, and people always say, oh, these guys are great, but these guys really were. I mean, they were super close. They just stood out, I think, from everybody else. And number one, obviously, beyond the fact that like Pat was, NFL, but a lot of people don't know that Kevin actually played pro baseball, and so they're very patriotic, had a passion, about the way they lived their lives, and when we there was a group of guys, I think, right after 9/11, and it's probably somewhat the same now. But they were older. When I enlisted, I wasn't 19. I was 26 when I enlisted, and so a lot of the guys that I enlisted through that RIP class, there were guys in there that were basically the same age as I was, 25. There were some guys that were, 32. Pat was, I think, 25 years old. He was a little bit, I think, a little bit younger than I was, and so. Naturally, I think in a group, guys see who, that guy's older, or you start learning about each other and you learn that guy's older, and then you just have more in common. And so it kind of gravitated to that within, maybe like a group of like 5 guys, including Pat and Kevin. And we all just kind of became friends, I think, because we had more in common in terms of where we were at in life. Not that we had more to give to the military, or that we had more of a sacrifice. But we'd all come from the private sector and the professional world, and trying to, so we weren't straight out of high school, and so that's kind of what led to the initial, I think, intrigue between this kind of small group.
And so when you got a chance to talk to Pat, do you remember any of the conversations? Do you remember anything that you guys discussed and anything of that nature?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so, Pat, in between, classes and in between training and stuff, it's kind of like, you see these movies and stuff where the guys go to prison and they end up learning everything about each other. It's kind of the same thing with the Army, as you've been in the military. And at some point, I think guys just get so bored that they just, share everything about their stories, and everybody ends up knowing everything. But one thing I remember about Pat and Kevin is they were genuinely intrigued in learning about other people and where they came from, and that made them different. But he was interested in the fact that I had come from Hollywood and had kind of given away that he knew that I'd written a screenplay. His brother was his youngest brother was an actor and was out there, I think, trying to do stuff. And so Pat and Kevin had no interest in media or the film or anything like that, but they were always intrigued with I think their youngest brother, who they said thought was really talented as an actor. And so, the discussions, they would ask, tell me about your screenplay. And it was this story about the construction of the Hoover Dam and these two brothers. And I had expressed how, the characters in my screenplay, Pat and Kevin reminded me of kind of like the real life versions of them. And then we'd go back a little bit more, like Pat and I are talking, and basically like all of, we shared basically the same favorite movies. And so there was just a lot in common. Good guys, there for a reason, and willing to lay it on the line.
Do you remember where you were when you heard the news that he was killed?
Yep, 100%. I was in Ramadi, Iraq. Just had come back from a mission in Albania, and they circled us around and in the courtyard at one of the places that we were at, and they did like a nightly brief, which was not totally abnormal. But then at the end of the brief, they just ended it with saying, "Hey, one of the Tillman brothers was killed this evening." And I remember thinking, like instantly, I was like, "Oh my gosh! Like, who is it, Pat or is it Kevin?" Split second kind of thing. And then, probably right as I thought it, they ended up saying who it was, and just like everybody, I think, it was like just totally just blows you away, and it was pretty shocking.
For those who don't know, Pat Tillman was a Ranger, as you just mentioned, so the community is all fairly tight, and it's not uncommon. The same thing in the special ops community. When they lose one of their own, it goes through the ranks fairly quickly. Did you get a sense that when you looked at those guys, because I've seen documentaries on Pat, and I read a whole bunch of books on him, and, as much as I feel like I can know somebody without knowing them, I feel like I know Pat and his spirit and everything else. But a lot of people said that Pat was like, seemed like he was invincible. And when you heard that he was killed, everyone's first thought was, it can't be, because it's Pat,
Yeah, I mean, for sure, that's I don't think I ever really thought of anybody invincible. I understood like the threat, and it seemed very real to me. But no question that with Pat, or whether it was Pat or anybody else, or several other of my friends that ended up getting killed, in action, and it always was the same. It was always the same reaction, which is, yeah, it can't be, like that can't be, and. So I don't know. For me, at least, it never kind of changes, no matter who it is.
Sure. Well, again, sorry for the loss of your friend, and obviously, we all feel the same pain, and the country felt the pain of Pat's loss, and everything that happened after the fact. Let it be what it is. It had nothing to do with what Pat wanted to do and what he was about, and that, obviously. And the story that it should be told is, you know, what Pat was about and who he was, not the way he died. But beyond that, let's get back to your story. And again, I appreciate you sharing that. But let's get back to your story. You mentioned that you were in Ramadi in Iraq in 2004. So that's when you got back there. What was that deployment like, and what were you doing?
That deployment was very, very different from the first deployment. So on that deployment, it was actually just I was in Alpha Company, 2nd Platoon, and on that deployment, we had actually separated from the main company, and we were there, and so we were extremely busy, and it was a completely different deployment. I mean, one of the first missions I remember us going on, it was like most of the time the deployment before, we were out in the desert, you know, trying to keep the Republican Guard from escaping and different stuff like that. And then this one, it was like we were embedded in the city. And so the mission had completely changed. And you know, it was like we had to really bring, you know, our A game on this one because there was just so much going on. It wasn't just like a desert anymore. And I can remember one of the first missions we went on was Oliver North.
Wow.
Ended up coming with us. Yeah, it was pretty. It was high profile, but with a bunch of you know, low profile guys, and he had cameras. And it was just a really weird scenario, but the mission itself was really it was very much like kind of, you know, like the Black Hawk Down type mission, except for, you know, it did go sideways. And so that whole, you know, deployment, you know, just extremely busy, constantly doing things. A lot of people didn't believe, you know, that Rangers, you know, we could do multiple missions, you know, whether it's a daytime or night. We could do multiple missions in the same night, or, you know, a day mission, and then we do like a couple of night missions. So it was just super, super fast paced, and you know, definitely needed that, I think, for me, in you know, that time frame, because that was a deployment for me, you know, where Pat had, you know, been killed, and there were some things happening for me personally in my life outside of, you know, that Pat's loss, where I really just kind of dove in and focused on my work and my guys, and the deployment, you know, ended up flying by, but we were just extremely, extremely busy. And Ramadi was just a total hotbed. I mean, constantly being mortared. Just, it was wild.
Did you lose anybody on that deployment?
We did not lose anybody on that deployment. No. It was amazing. You know, and once again, super busy, doing amazing things, but never came up against an adversary. So, you know, our mission it's just a different mission. And so, most of the time we end up going and getting people, and you know, they might be sleeping or something.
Right. The interesting thing about, you know, the timeline of the Iraq War, as you mentioned, for the, you know, you're there the second time, you're saying you're not encountering a lot of resistance, and, you know, for those who obviously weren't there and those listening that, you know, don't remember, 2003 was the invasion. You know, that was it was March 2003, and so for the first, you know, basically 6 months, you know, as you mentioned, you guys kind of ran through them like a hot knife through butter, and then it was over. And then from, you know, the end of 2003 into 2004. There was kind of like this quiet in Iraq. Like, we were still there, and we were still had a presence and everything else, but nothing had really started to stir up. And it really, you kind of talked about the very beginning of when things really started to flare. Because when you get into 2005 and 2006, that was the height of the violence in Iraq, and hence why they had the surge in 2007 to quell it. But, you know, you're talking about the very end of the calmness and the beginning of it becoming the wild, wild west all over the place when you were there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so in 2004, it was already wild west. So Zarqawi was cutting people's heads off.
Yeah.
They had just strung up the 3 Blackwater guys in Fallujah, mm-hmm. and burned them on the bridge, and, you know, completely like devoured their bodies. And so Nick Berg, the decapitation of him. I remember the video. We had one of the first videos, and we ended up not we directly, but some guys that were with our unit basically had ended up finding like his body. He was strung over like a freeway somewhere, and obviously no head. And I can remember that video and saying something like, "Oh my gosh, I have to see this video," and I felt compelled. I remember my platoon sergeant saying, "No." He's like, "I'm not going to let you see that."
I remember watching it.
I'm good.
Yeah, I remember watching it.
I watched. I think I watched that one. I watched one more, and I've never watched another one since. I saw enough of what I needed to see and to understand the evilness, and that was it. But yeah, I mean, 2004 was definitely hot. Fallujah was crazy. I mean, it was absolutely wild. So, we would go up to Fallujah. I remember a number of times to look at doing different things, and so it was super, super hot. We were all over Iraq at that time.
And for those who aren't familiar, for the Lucia Ramadi area, about 30 to 45 minutes directly west of Baghdad. It's not very far away, but probably one of the most violent and as Joel said, it's the hottest action there around in Iraq for a really, really long time. So you get out of that second deployment unscathed. When do you get back for number 3?
So number 3 was that was around. Oh my gosh, they're like all blending together. Number 3 was January of 2005, and then through the spring, and that was also a very, very busy deployment. And
so we were there at the same time. I got there in March of 2005.
Okay.
So,
yeah. So I think we were there until about the April time frame, but exactly. Super busy, IEDs, giant explode. I mean, the mortars. It was wild, but successful. I mean, super successful mission, unscathed. I mean, the stuff that we were doing, and a lot of times the people, at least initially, the Velcro, no patches, all that kind of stuff. And I think they figured out pretty quickly. They just would see, us rolling around and be heavy with guns and gun trucks and equipment. And they just didn't want a piece of that. You know what I mean? So, we just didn't really come up against resistance again, but we're, very active, for our mission set.
Yeah. And to Joel's point, for, again, the non-special ops folks listening, the regular Army does things dramatically different, still effective, but dramatically different than the special ops community does. And special ops guys back then had different uniforms. And the current military uniform you see was derived from the special ops community, with the pockets on the sleeves and everything else, and, accessible from the front chest. That wasn't the way the old uniform used to be. And so, as Joel said, when the enemy saw they were smart enough to realize, hey, those guys aren't the regular fighters. Those guys are a little bit tougher than the guys we're used to going up against. And as you mentioned, they wanted no part of it a lot of the times. And what we call the porcupine effect. You go out there, shrills out, and scare the hell out of everybody, and nobody wants any part of you, as opposed to sitting there kind of being like a small, timid little animal. And again, not saying that the regular Army was that, but just drawing the analogy. When the deployments end, you're coming up on the end of your tenure in the military, because you got out as an E5. And was it just because your contract was up and you were done and you wanted to move on to something else? What was the reason that you left?
I just think there was a couple of reasons. First of all, I enlisted as a citizen soldier. Never anticipated, I mean, we had history to rely on, and I just never anticipated that the, quote unquote, it might have a different name today. I know it's changed a couple of times, but the global war on terrorism would last for so long.
Yeah.
I mean, I literally thought after our first Iraq deployment I mean, like you said, it kind of like got quiet, and everybody, I just thought it was done. Like everybody was like, oh yeah, that's done. I thought it was going to be very similar to, you know, the Desert Storm deployment, where it was like just a few days and then, you know, it was done. And so each subsequent deployment, I was like, wow, this, we're still going on deployment. This is pretty crazy. This is wild. And so I had, you know, planned on going back to the private sector and going back to you know, pursue the industry that I'd been in before. And the other thing is that I also understood I loved what I did. And there was an element, you know, like I'd mentioned even when I was a child, where I did like the military. As a kid, I was obsessed with the military. And so I knew there was a part of me, you know, my dad served, he was, you know, what they call a lifer. And so there was a part of me that understood that, if I did, you know, maybe stay in for the next 2 years, that those next 2 years could change when they asked you to re-enlist again. And they had already offered me, shortly after my third deployment, a squad leader position, which would have required a waiver because I had just pretty much become an E5. But the deal was I would have had to re-enlist for 2 years. And so I kind of saw, for me, I loved, you know, serving, and I loved, the Rangers. I liked the special operations community, but for me, I also saw, okay, you know, this really requires, you know, this is one life. Like this requires all of you. And, at that point in time, you know, I don't think I was there. There were other things that were going on. I just had a daughter, who, was not living, you know, in Savannah, Georgia at the time. And I really felt, drawn to going into to being part of her life. And so there were a number of decisions. I'd also had gone and tried out for, another unit and ended up, you know, not making the selection. And so that kind of also helped me, with my decision. But I always felt confident that, if I really felt like it was where I needed to be, that I could always come back and re-enlist.
Did anybody try to talk you out of it?
100%, all the way to the last day. The battalion commander, who I'm still friends with to this day, who's General Richard Clark, who is just an amazing guy. Literally on like the day before I was leaving, he was still trying to keep me there, you know. But yeah, I mean, everybody will try to keep you there, you know, and I get it. I understand it. I mean, and it's hard, you know, it's hard to even really kind of like leave. But like I said, you know, you have to make an assessment and then decide what's the best path.
I mean, did that make you feel good that everybody tried so hard, or did you think that it's just what they do for everybody kind of deal?
I mean, I'm sure that I'm not the only one. I'm sure that there's many, many guys that they probably have that conversation with. At the same time, I know just from being in Ranger Battalion, there's probably guys that they're like holding the door open for, trying to scoot them out as quickly as possible. But, you know, I would like to think in my mind that, you know, they really saw value in the time that I'd spent there, and that, you know, I know a lot of the guys that I'd served with, you know, valued my presence on the battlefield. And so, it makes you feel good when especially when you're getting out, because you don't know if you're making the right decision or not.
What do you remember the most about the special ops community, and what do you miss the most?
Man, I think the deployments stick out in my head the most. I mean, obviously it's really fun, you know, back in the States, and you know, they use the phrase like, you know, going downtown, especially in Savannah. Savannah's such a beautiful town. The first sergeant, I remember the safety brief, they'd always say, hey, look, you know, don't go downtown, you know, beating your chest and lighting your hair on fire. And so in regards to, you know, that, there's a lot of fun in that, but really I think it's deployments, because you have such a focus, and and you really just, want to do well, obviously because you want to survive, but also you understand that you're an important part of the unit and the unit's survival in terms of the mission that's in front of you and the guys that you serve around with. It's kind of like, in a really weird way, it's kind of like a summer camp, with guns and a bunch of DVDs, movies, and video games.
So you leave the military, that part of your life is over, and you end up trying to go back to Hollywood. And one of the things that you're doing right now is you own a small film studio production company. Am I labeling it the right way? In Texas?
Yeah, definitely not studio. Yeah, so Austin, Texas, very small film company called Cedarwood Films.
Mm-hmm.
We have two intellectual properties that we have gained the exclusive option to purchase. And one
of those, I'm sorry to cut you off, but one of those happens to be the story of a previous Hazard Ground guest, Nate Self, and the Battle of Takur Ghar. We bring this out there, like the Tacker Gar story is the impetus for this podcast. And I've said that several times on it, and I've told you about it when we've talked before we record this episode. But, I think that story is one that needs to be told. And all these stories on the Hazard Ground could be actually made into movies. I mean, they're that kind of, there's the depth of all these stories. But what is it about the Tacker Gar battle that really drew you to it enough to say, hey, I want to make this into a movie?
So Tacker Gar is as personal to me as it can get without me of actually being on that deployment.
Right.
Because first of all, on the Ranger side, it was the 1st Ranger Battalion, Alpha Company, 1st Platoon that deployed on that mission. And as you've already established, Captain Nate Self, at the age of 25 years old, was the ground force commander and the platoon TL. And so when I got to Ranger Battalion, all the guys who I already knew were airborne rangers in the sky that I had memorized. They were the guys that had died on that mountaintop that day, and all of their namesakes were still on the doors in the 1st Platoon hallway. And I remember walking down Alpha Company, 1st Platoon hallway. When I first got there, all of the guys were on their 2nd deployment to Afghanistan. And so it was just rear D, and which is kind of a scary thing also because you're the new guy, but nobody's there yet, so you know that they're coming. And but walking down the hallway, and there were literally notes on the door written to all the guys on the different doors with like knives stuck into the door with the notes, and it just had become like a memorial. Like each person's door had become like a memorial. And so the guys that, during RIP, learning the Ranger Creed, learning your airborne rangers in the sky, and all the guys that I knew I had to know, going to 1st Ranger Battalion, it could have been any company, but I got assigned to Alpha Company. And so the story was already personal to me. The guys that served during the Battle of Takur Ghar, nearly all of them were, fellow Rangers that I had fought with in subsequent deployments, and had been on missions with them, and training, and then going out downtown and becoming friends. So on that level, I feel very connected to the story, and then I started first writing, because I thought it was such an amazing story. It was 2004. I actually started writing the first pages of what I thought could be a screenplay for the movie.
Okay, so take me through the rest of it. Where are you now with it?
So today we have a draft. I'm currently in the process of writing another path to the story. I'm acting as an executive producer. Actively got it out. We've got it to a lot of big names. A lot of big companies have almost had it there with some big studios, and there's a lot of intrigue for the story. And at the same time, there's a lot of saturation for military stories in Hollywood. I think that, really special ops and military stories have become almost like the new Westerns, for the modern era. And so, it's always been a question for me, because the first draft that I completed, I remember I completed the first draft right at the same time that American Sniper screenplay had been completed. And a friend of mine that was an agent in the had repped one of the actors in the movie for the casting. He ended up saying, "Hey, they just sent me over this screenplay. It's American Sniper." And I'd known, obviously, because of the book,
right,
and lots of stuff. So watching these things come together, and wondering, knowing what an amazing story the Battle of Takur Ghar is, and then seeing all these other amazing stories as well come together, it got me very excited. That this project was going to get done, that this story would be shared with a worldwide audience potentially.
And for those, again, who aren't familiar with the Battle of Takur Ghar, it's on an earlier episode of The Hazard Ground. If you haven't heard it yet, go check out the Nate Self. It's actually a 2-part episode because it's in such great detail, and Nate Self tells just an amazing story. And it's a battle that I feel the same way. Without ever actually having to been there, it just, it pulled me. It drew me to it. And the story was so real and so raw. And I agree wholeheartedly with what you're doing and support it 100%. And I hope this is one time that you don't finish second. I really hope this thing gets made, because it just, it's when people hear it, it's going to touch them. It's really going to reach deep into their souls and in their hearts. And we know all about Lone Survivor and American Sniper and those things, but this story is of that same ilk, Joel. It sings the same message, and everybody in America should see it and hear it.
Yeah, I agree, and I appreciate your perspective on it. It's definitely, I think it's definitely a unique story. It's also one of the first story of its kind. At that time of the war, it was very early on, so 2002, and for so many casualties in the special operations world. But I think the hook for me in the story is just like, there's something truly extraordinary about how the entire special operations community, was converged on that mountain that day. Tacker Gar translated to tall mountain in Pashtun. So it's just amazing that everybody had come together to get one guy, and then 7 guys ended up, not leaving the mountain alive. So it's definitely an amazing story.
Well, Joel, you have just an inspiring story and to say the least, an odd career path. Nobody could have written your particular story and predicted the way it was going to go. But, obviously your service to our country is invaluable. And as a brother in arms, I appreciate everything that you've done. But, I know this passion project of yours is going to turn into something a lot more than that. And one day we'll see the Battle of Takur Ghar and 2 wars and Tall Mountain, whatever you want to call it, on the big screen somewhere. So I wish you nothing but the best of luck, brother.
Thanks so much, Mark, and thank you so much to Hazard Ground and all the veterans that have served with us.
Joel Carpenter, thanks for being here.
Thank you, brother.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.